Hey, it's Jim, and this is FRM Part II, the topic on market risk measurement and management, and the chapter on the Vasicek and Gauss plus models. I want to quickly remind you that we are nearing the end of a conversation on the term structure of interest rates, and I don't want you to lose sight of the very simple graph between yield to maturity and time to maturity, which describes the term structure of interest rates. Remember, we can have an upward sloping or a downward sloping or a flat yield curve. So the simplicity of that graph is exactly what we're trying to do here in these series of chapters. However, in order to help us do things like hedge and price some derivative contracts, we're most interested in not just the upward slope, but the change in that upward slope. And that's what we've been doing over these last several chapters. Remember, we did some interest rate trees. We looked at the Holy model. We did the Black model, the Cox-Ingersoll-Ross model. And all of those models essentially tried to help us determine what is that change in interest rate going to be so that we can use that change in interest rate to predict a future interest rate to help us hedge and price some of these complex derivative securities. So I want you to make sure that you keep track of the simplicity of term structure of interest rates. And then we have added the complexification of these models. Now, the good news is in this chapter, we're going to remind ourselves of what that Vasicek model looks like. And I wonder if you guys pay attention to this, but this chapter and another chapter are actually taken from one chapter in a book called Fixed Income Securities Tools for Today's Markets. So essentially, our two chapters is really just one chapter from a textbook. And then we'll remind ourselves what was the problem with that Vasicek model, and then we'll try to resolve it with the Gauss plus model. Just for learning objectives, notice there's a describe and a compare and an explain. We are going to have to do some calculations. We'll do that at the end of this slide deck. But notice that what we're doing is we're saying, okay, this is what we've done in the past in those other models, in particular the Vasicek model. How does that compare to this new Gauss plus model? And what we'll see is that, look at that third one, that third learning objective, where we're going to have to calculate. What the Gauss plus model simply does is it takes the Vasicek model and adds a medium and a long-term factor to maybe offer a more complex and more complete and yet more accurate description of an estimation of what those future rates might be. And then this last learning objective, I'm going to editorialize here just kind of quickly. The chapter does a good job of explaining how those parameters can be estimated, and there's a very good example in there, but I wish it were just a little bit more, a little bit less parsimonious. How's that for a good word of the day? All right, let's go ahead and start with the Vasicek model. We remember that that's a single factor interest rate model. That single factor, of course, is the short-term interest rate. Short term could be, like a day, maybe a week, maybe a month, whatever that short term rate might be. Let me just remind you of some of those core features. The chapter doesn't really tell us a whole lot about this Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process. It is a mean reverting process. That's probably the most important thing that you should remember. It's also a Gaussian process, which you should remember has that's the name from Carl Gauss, who was the originator or one of the originators of the normal distribution stuff. And it's also a Markov process, which helps us determine the probability of an event of a future state based on what that current event is. Some good examples of that are predicting the weather, traffic flow, which I don't understand traffic. Maybe you guys can explain traffic to me some days. I'm sitting in traffic, I'm not going anywhere, then I'm going 60 miles an hour, and then I stop, and then I start. I don't understand traffic at all, but apparently the Markov process can help explain. Of course, we don't care about any of that stuff. What the Markov process helps us do, and that's what this OU process is telling us, is for things like random walks. So there's the Vasicek model down at the bottom, and it is a stochastic differential equation. That sounds super important. All it means is that what we're trying to do is trying to figure out changes of a continuous variable. Now, I shouldn't have to remind you of what each of the notations stand for, but here's a good reminder. So a couple of things that are interesting about this is that we've got this Brownian motion process, the Wiener process, which is, going back to, let me go back here quickly, this OU process, which tells us that we have random market fluctuations. We're standing on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange and we're saying, what's going to happen in the next hour? We have no idea. I mean, we can try to predict, but, the mean is going to be, sometimes it's up and sometimes it's down. So the mean is that, there's pretty much nothing going to happen. But we need to be prepared for when something happens. So we call that the shock, the change in W. There's that standard deviation, so that's instantaneous. That just means a continuous volatility of interest rates. And by the way, what we're going to learn here, and that might be just a little bit of a reminder, is that short-term rates have their own set of volatility, which is relatively small. Long-term rates have their own set of volatility, which is relatively small, but a little bit larger than the short-term volatility. And then the intermediate volatility is super high because that's kind of where we're focused. So we have this kind of a hump-shaped picture of volatility, and that's going to be super important. I'll remind you of that as we go through this slide deck. And then what did I say in this previous slide back here? Mean-reverting process, the OU process. So there's our K, the speed of mean reversion. So remember the example that you learned when you were a little person, when someone said something like, there's this, the tail of the tortoise and the hare. So that K tells us, are we going really, really fast or are we going really, really slowly? And then that theta is the mean level of interest rates over time. Some of the properties based on that previous slide. So mean reversion, that just means, of course, that if we're low, then we're going to go high. And if we're high, then we're going to go lower. And that's going to hit that mean reversion. And by the way, mean reversion is this fantastic concept that has its tremendous applications for sports. Those of you who like to watch basketball, which I like to watch it less and less because it has become a chuck away on the three-point shot. But you watch teams. When they make a whole bunch of threes, then what are they going to do? They're going to miss a bunch of threes. There's no doubt about it. This is why I always tell my friends and my cousin, I'm saying, look, if I were a coach and we came out and we hit 7 of the first 10 threes of the game, I wouldn't let my team shoot another 3 because they're going to miss 10 out of the next 10. So mean reversion, I remember learning this when I was in graduate school. Now, this is a long time ago, and I remember thinking, I don't understand what this means. And then it finally dawned on me, this is perfect. And so we take this, the reality of life, mean reversion, and apply it to that term structure of interest rates. All right, there's the normal distribution. We talk about that regularly. You probably don't need me to re-explain normal distributions for you. But what it does is that it allows the possibility of negative rates because we have to worry about that left-hand side. For a term structure, it offers a closed form solution for lots and lots of things, but mainly bond prices and yields and other things. I mean, closed form solution just means that you have a set of parameters and variables and you can throw them into the model and you get an answer. Think of a non-closed form solution as if you were trying to throw infinity into an equation and you would think, okay, I don't really know what that means. Oftentimes comment to students that when we talk about federal debt, And it's now up into the, in 2025, it's up into the, mid 30s of the trillions of dollars. And I always say something like, there's no way that's a closed form solution because nobody has any idea what $36 trillion worth of federal debt means in 2025. So what don't we like about this Vasicek model? We learned this in that previous chapter. Unrealistic with negative interest rates, although I've got to say that, of course, in the Great Depression here in the United States, and also in the very short time period during the 2008 financial crisis, and some other times where we had deep recessions in the United States history, that U.S. Treasury bills were selling at a premium, which means that there was a negative interest rate. So, for the exam, I would say, yes, this is a problem, but sometimes it's very helpful when we have these dramatic economic events. If you go back to those parameters, the mean reversion, the average, and the standard deviation, those are assumed to be constant in that Vasicek model. And of course, what do we know? We know the difference between a static model and a dynamic model. And so those parameters probably don't align with the changing dynamics of the macroeconomic scenario. And of course, in the Vasicek model, we're just doing this short interest rate. So we're only looking at one rate, which might oversimplify that yield curve. What can we do with this? It helps us with risk management. And I said this earlier, there's derivatives pricing, and there's another closed form reference. So what we're doing here is we're going to say something like, well, what don't we like about that Vasicek model? What can we add to it? And so the simple solution is to say, well, if Vasicek focuses on short term, well, why don't we add something else, something other than short term? So the Gauss plus model, it adds a medium-term factor and a long-term factor, and we're calling it the Gauss model. We're calling it the Gauss plus model because we're relying on all that normal distribution stuff, but we're also adding some extra factors, which could be considered one of those, risk factors that we talked about in lots of those other chapters. So here we go. We have the short-term factor. That's just noted R, like it has been before. We'll have the medium-term factor, which is noted M, and the long-term factor, which is noted L. Think how genius that we are in finance. So M, intermediate term expectations. So intermediate term, that can mean lots and lots of different things for different kinds of people. But GARP seems to think that short-term over 2 or 3 years, I would say 4 or 5 years. Now remember, you're not going to have a chance to write this out like other professional designations offer you. You're just going to have to pick between or pick among, four choices in the multiple choice framework. I can't imagine GARP would say 2 to 3 would be answer A and 5 to 6 would be answer B. Who knows what medium term means? But let's go ahead and stick with 2 and 3. And then long term is, something beyond that middle term. So look over in that just simple illustration there. We've got 3 factors now. So this is a really good exam question. It's a simple one. Vasicek and Cox, Ingersoll Ross, they have the 1 factor. So here we now have 3 factors. Each factor, of course, is subject to the mean reverting kinds of a process. Think about this, that, if a team they shoot 70% from the 3 in the first half, and they have no turnovers in the first half, and they make all their foul shots in the first half. What does that mean? That means they're going to stink at it in the second half. Now, of course, it's not an exact one-to-one relationship, so maybe it's a game, and then maybe the next game, and then maybe the next game, however that works. This is so cool because you guys know, if you listen to me over the years, I love to give sports analogies. And And so this basketball and football and soccer, these can apply almost directly to the term structure of interest rates. So it makes sense then that if short-term rates mean revert, that medium and long-term rates ought to mean revert as well. Now, here's the really, really cool thing about this plus model is that the mean reverting factor is probably not going to be the same for each of those time periods. So short term go like this quickly, medium term more slowly, long term factor is very slowly. I'll use a term that my grandmother used when I was a little guy. She would say, "Jimmy, you're putzing." So think of the long-term factor as the putzers out there, very slowly. Now remember, I was telling you earlier about short-term volatility being pretty low, long-term volatility being pretty low, but probably a little bit higher than short-term, but then medium. So here's this hump-shaped volatility. I can't imagine that this is not a great question. If I were making up this exam. Now remember, you only have a fixed number of questions that GARP can ask you. Remember in part 1, you took 100 questions. You're not going to take that many in part 2, but you have more chapters to worry about. So you really have to kind of pick and choose what you think is going to show up on the exam. I wish I could tell you that this and this and this are going to be on the exam, but you never know what GARP is thinking. But it sounds to me like this slide is a really high probability of something showing up, and I think that hump-shaped volatility is important because it goes a long way. Here, let me go back here. It goes a long way in explaining the structure of this plus model, and of course, piggybacking on that, there's the dynamic behavior that says something like, we can divide that time period into what looks like how the government figures stuff out. So GARP calls this, the policy or policy rates. But then we have market expectations. You have the bondholders out there. You have the swap dealers. You have even on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. What are those market expectations? The New York Stock Exchange and the New York Bond Exchange, and the New York options and swap exchanges, these individuals and groups of individuals that make up this market, they're of course worried about the short term. They want to know what's going to happen in the next 5 minutes, but they always have their eye on that intermediate term. And then you take a look at the macroeconomic factors and you try to pick and choose between and among all of those that are important and which ones are more important for today. But in the end, those macroeconomic factors, they play a role in the mean reversion for that long-term or those long-term events. In the model, we'll see that there are two sources of risk. There is a Wiener process for medium term and a Wiener process for long term. And so that's super important. And then there's practical applications. I said this earlier. What did I say? Hedging and pricing and trading. Now, this is where the chapter gets a little bit redundant because what we're doing is comparing stuff that we're doing now versus stuff that we did in a previous chapter. But remember, it's just one chapter from this textbook that I was telling you about earlier. So let's go ahead and look at this learning objective. Compare and contrast. So there's the Vasicek model down there. It has that single factor. So all we're doing is we're trying to determine the change in the short-term rate, and it's going to be a function of the change in time. There's that D. Remember, D just stands for change. And it's going to be a function of the difference between what we think is that average variable versus what it is today. There's the R sub t. And then we have some mean reversion factor. Remember, there's just one of these, so the speed with which it reverts back to the mean. And then we're going to add some kind of a shock thing out there. So, you can think of a shock as financial crisis of 2008. You can think of a shock as COVID. But these models also allow us to consider much smaller shocks. When you think of a shock, COVID, that was a shock, right? But when inflation in, what year was that? 2021 spiked in the United States up to over 9%. That was a shock. But when inflation went from 2% to 3%, that's a shock too. And these models allow you to consider smaller shocks. So it doesn't have to be like an electrocution shock. It could be just like a minor bzz. How was that? All right, so that first diamond point tells us about the mean reversion and those notations from the Vasicek model. What we're going to do is in the plus model, we're going to add a short term, a medium term, and a long term factor. So look at the bottom to capture more complex rate dynamics, including that hump-shaped volatility, which is going to allow us to price more complex derivative securities. Remember, we have things like an option on a swap contract. You can call it a swaption. That thing, it's relatively simple, but it's way more complex than just a regular old call option. So what do we like about that Vasicek model? It's simple. You can do the math very easily. In fact, I have my students use the Vasicek model. I did it a couple years ago when I taught a financial institutions class. And then I do it when I teach every spring semester. I teach a derivative securities class. So it's pretty simple. Undergraduates can get this computationally efficient, but of course it lacks flexibility. And remember that it just assumes that volatility is constant. Remember that that Cox-Ingersoll-Ross model allowed for volatility to increase over time. That's why that Cox-Ingersoll-Ross model had a square root term inside of it, which doesn't exist in the Vasicek model. So the Gauss plus model has the three factors, of course, and so this is super important. A great question is to say, all right, we love Vasicek, but why do we love the plus model even more? Well, there's your good answer. Applications, I've said this many times before, pricing complex derivatives. All right, so let's take a look, a little more detail of this plus model, and we'll hit this learning objective in which we want to calculate. So let me go back here real quick. So here's our Vasicek model. So this is nice and simple. We like it. We just need a couple of variables. So the question then becomes, how are we going to add a second and a third variable? And by the way, this is not unlike taking that simple option pricing model, which has those four input variables. Remember, it had stock price and exercise price and time and risk-free rate of interest, and adding the fifth important variable, which of course was volatility, and all of a sudden you get the Black-Scholes-Merton option pricing model, and two of those three are winning Nobel Prizes in economics. So it's not as dramatic of a change, but that's what we're doing here. We're just adding an extra variable. In this case, we're adding two extra variables. So what we need to do is we need to take a look at the short-term factor. So this is very similar to what we did before. Notation is just a little bit different. But then we're going to add a medium-term factor and a long-term factor. So let's go skip down to the long-term factor first. What we're doing, remember we said, what was that word I used? Putzing, right? Revert slowly to its equilibrium value. There's the mu there in the LT. So that's similar to what Vasicek did. There's a constant out there, and there's the change in time, and all we're doing is the same kind of thing. So let me do this. So here is the Vasicek model for the short term. Here is the Vasicek model for the long term, okay? So we're doing similar kinds of things. We're adding this factor. But what makes this really, really important, and remember now that short and long term, they have relatively low volatilities. So that term out there, the plus standard deviation for the long term, that's probably going to be relatively small. It's not going to add a whole lot not to the change. But when we get to the medium term, well, we need to find out the hump. So we have small here, small out here, and then the hump. So that we need to figure out where is that peak and how do we compute that peak? And that's going to be way more complex. So notice the first part of that. The first part of that medium-term factor is identical to, and let me go back here real quick, it's identical to the short-term factor, but we're just applying it to long-term. I'm sorry, to the medium-term. It's identical to the long-term factor. Now, of course, the long-term factor adds the shock. Remember, there's no shock. I went one too many times. There's no shock in this short-term factor. And then we have a plus. And boy, we're going to do some extra things out here. And the chapter really doesn't do a very good job of explaining this. It tells us that we need some kind of volatility for the medium term, but how are we going to adjust that? Of course, over at the end, we're going to have that medium term shock, but then we need to worry about correlation coefficients because we're in the middle. We need to worry about what's the correlation with the long term, what's the correlation with the intermediate term mean reversion? And that's what that little rho is there, and then the 1 minus the rho squared. So you have correlation in that first part times the shock, and then you have 1 minus the r squared, think of it that way, times the long-term shock. So the cool thing about this medium-term factor is that it is considering not only what happens in that 2 to 3 year period, but it's considering what happens in the 2 and 3 year period and how it relates to that longer-term period. Boy, I have a headache after explaining all of that. So let's go ahead and work through the math here. My advice is for you just to go ahead and stop the video and do the math. You can substitute these values in. You get short-term factor there, you get the intermediate factor there, and the long-term factor. So I'll give you a chance to pause. What I'll say now is, remember, there are no good problems at the end. In fact, there are no problems at the end of this chapter. So I want you to go back, once you pause the video, work through this problem, I want you to go back to our platform and look at this chapter. And I think there are about 15 questions in there. And there's one question. And so you'll be able to do this one, then you'll be able to do that one. And you should be fine for this learning objective. So go ahead and pause, and I'll see you on the other side. Welcome back for those of you who paused the video and worked through your calculator on that previous problem and went to our portal and worked on that other problem as well. Let's take a look at this final learning objective. How are we going to estimate these parameters that fit into this plus model? Well, the answer is going to be regression analysis. And the chapter does a really good job of telling us that the authors collected data from 2014 to 2022. They looked at Fed target interest rate data. They looked at Treasury data, and they looked at zero coupon bond yields. And from that Treasury data, they kind of extracted some zero coupon bond yields. So essentially what the authors did was take a variety of those yields and regress them against a variety of different maturities of those different kinds of yields. And in the process, what that does is it gets us those input parameters for the Gauss plus model. So let's go ahead and start with the mean reversion parameters. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at changes in bond yields. So these are the zero coupon bond yields. So don't be surprised if you see on the exam zero coupon bond changes in yields versus some kind of a benchmark. So we're doing changes in yields versus changes in yields. We did that in a previous chapter as well. Now, when we do that, what we can observe is that those regression coefficients are going to represent the mean reversion speeds of those factors. And clearly, if you take some time and look through this chapter, the mean reversion speeds of short-term versus medium-term versus long-term, they go in descending order. Did I say that right? Yeah, because what did we say? The rabbit is the short-term. Now, among the reasons that we can call these the mean reversion parameters is that they do not depend on volatility. And that changes when we get to estimating the volatility and correlation parameters. What we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing. We're going to make these exact same regressions. We're going to try to interpret these regression coefficients. But the way this works is in the following manner. What these authors did is that they observed the volatilities in the term structure. They ran the model with lots and lots of changes in yields on zeros and changes in yields on the benchmark. And they did this a bunch of times, and they isolated those parameters in which the volatility of the model matched the actual term structure volatility. And that's why we can say those regression coefficients implicitly represent the mean reversion speeds while considering those volatilities. So there's matching going on in there. And then for long term, what we're doing is we're just going back to statistics. We're going to minimize the sum of the squared errors between those observed yields and the model implied yields for the entire term structure. But what that does then is it gives us a sense of what is that long-term equilibrium rate, and that depends on things like market expectations and macroeconomic trends. And then we can summarize these things by viewing federal funds target rates, forward rates, medium and long term, and then those zero coupon bonds and their derived yields. So this is a practical application. We can take this model and we can throw it right out into the treasury markets. We can throw it into corporate bond markets, to muni bond markets. We can throw them out there into any place that we want. All right, that takes us through a fun chapter. At least it was fun for me. And it ends the series of term structure chapters. So I want you to go back to our portal. We've got, what did I say, 15 or 16 questions. I want you to work through those. And I think you'll be able to handle questions in Vasicek. So what did I say at the very introduction? I want you to be very sensitive that what we're still looking at is that simple term structure, upward sloping or downward sloping yield curve, but we're very interested in the change in yield. So what I would do if I were you guys, I would go back to these series of chapters and I would list each one of the models in this series of chapters and just jot down one or two things that you think are relevant and maybe good exam questions. And then I would keep that. Now I would do it on an index card, and I would keep the index card in my back pocket. I would carry it around and look at it all the time. Maybe you guys could do this on your phones. So I think what that would do is summarize this series of chapters on the yield curve. So, hey, I super appreciate you paying attention to me. Have a great day and good luck studying.